Hello everyone, Dr. Ames here. This time I'd like to talk about managing decision making and problem solving. Here are our learning objectives for this time. We'll talk about decision making in general, the types of decisions, and the conditions in particular under which we have to make our decisions. Um, and then we'll talk about some of the conceptual ideas associated with making a decision, rational perspective, and so forth, and the steps that we take in the rational decision-making process. And then we'll talk a little bit about the behavioral side of all of that, making decisions. And then we'll talk a little bit about some other related topics about group and team decision making, and some of those advantages and disadvantages that lie in those topics, and so forth. Well, when we make decisions, we're really just choosing amongst choices. We could do this, or we could do that, or maybe we could even do that other option over there. So decision making really is about the act, the process of choosing an alternative from a set of alternatives in order to satisfy the event or the challenge we're trying to overcome, or to come to just solve the problem. So uh, really that is the key factor here, is the idea that we have to really, before we can make a good decision, we're faced with finding out what are all the possible alternatives that we have to choose from to make the best decision. And of course, we want an effective decision, which is the one that actually solves our challenge or our problem for us. So some of the things that we have to do and that are characteristics of making effective decisions is that we want to have a goal in mind, a powerful goal that drives us. So it's got to be something that optimizes something that's important to us, like profits or like sales or like the welfare of our employees, or about our market share or our market dominance and so forth. So everything affects our decision making, but it is a process, and we're always trying to do a balancing act amongst these different factors. And so we make decisions not just about challenges and problems, but we also make them about opportunities. We have to be able to evaluate different alternatives to choose from to come up with the best response in a given situation, whether it is solving a problem, overcoming that challenge, or trying to take advantage of an opportunity and trying to decide, what do I do first and how do I proceed? So the decision-making process itself is really uh, just a thing that we do all the time subconsciously. We don't necessarily have to write these steps down, but sometimes in a very significant decision that has to be made, we might write things down because we want to make sure that we haven't forgotten what we've talked about, if it happens to be in a team sort of setting, or ourselves, that we write these things down and that we can choose from them. We can review the list and go back. So first, we acknowledge that we have to make a decision, and we try and understand everything about the parameters of that decision that we can. Once we've done that, then it comes to, what do we choose to solve this problem that we have, to make the decision. And this is where generally, I would say, as American culture, we fall down a little bit because we are very impatient. We often don't spend as much time as it takes to identify all the possible alternatives that we could choose from to come to the best and most effective decision in the end. We don't want to have to redo things. We don't want to waste time. That also speaks to our impatience. So we need to really make sure that we're spending as much time as it takes to identify all the possible alternatives. And then once we've done that, then we can choose the best alternative. What's going to be the best solution? Because it's not always possible. In fact, it's rarely possible to get the most perfect decision, one that satisfies everybody and everybody's interests. So quite often we are faced with choosing the best choice that we have to move ahead and have an effective decision. And then we just put it into practice. And of course, we do what all managers do. We monitor the situation, and then we evaluate the monitoring, what data have we collected, what does this tell us about the decision we made? Was it good? Was it bad? And so forth. So here, this is just what I've said. But we've got a nice little example to work through, and so it puts it in a business context for us. Let's just take a real close look at it. First, um, a plant manager sees that employee turnover is increased by 5%. Okay, so a plant manager, that's probably a middle manager. He has first line operational managers reporting to him, likely. The plant manager can do three things to address this problem of employee turnover. We can increase wages, we could increase benefits, or we could change hiring standards. And we've spent some time trying to identify all the possible alternatives, and these are the three things that was come up with. Okay, so we look at them individually and we start evaluating those so that we can select the best one. Increasing benefits might not be feasible. Why would that be? Well, for one thing, it's not something you can do quickly. Changing benefits really has implications for what do you change it to? Are you going to change providers? Quite often these things are complicated and they're in packages. And so it's a more long-term project where you would have to bring in probably the HR manager and say, we want to increase the benefits and how can we do that and what would be the cost? And so this would not be a quick and easy solution, maybe feasible, but likely not feasible certainly as an immediate solution. Because again, what are we trying to do? Trying to keep people from quitting. We're trying to retain people, so we're trying to reduce turnover if we can, because we see that it's increased by 5%. These are three things that we hope will maybe address that. Okay, so benefits probably is too timely, and it may not be good enough. Employees don't always look to what benefits are they getting, they're looking to their wages. So increasing wages and changing hiring conditions may satisfy all conditions. You're evaluating again, well, what are the particular characteristics of each choice? We can increase wages the quickest of anything. And we can easily find out if we're paying the current regional rate for the jobs in question and so forth. And then we have to make a decision, can we economically afford to do that? We do know that there's a clear link between wages and retention. Now, changing hiring standards might be also a feasible option. But if we try and be more careful, take longer to recruit and select when we do, this is a long-term project. And then we will have to, of course, monitor the progress of those employees, see how long before they leave the company if they do, and so forth. So this is something we would collect data about over time, and that is not going to solve the problem in the near future. So by analyzing all three of these options, we would say that probably we would increase wages as selecting the best alternative. And then what would we do? We would announce a bulletin to the employees, we're going to increase wages by such and such, and so forth. And then we monitor it from that point on and see if we've made an impact on the turnover rate. And that again will take some time to evaluate, but at least we have responded with what we think is the best alternative in the sense of being timely and really addressing the problem. Now, when it comes to making decisions, we have different types. Basically, it's either programmed or non-programmed. A program decision is one that happens all the time. You don't want to have to rethink it. You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel on a recurring basis. And so a program decision is something that occurs with a lot of frequency, or it's structured in some way because it happens all the time. For example, a structured decision is the annual employee evaluation. It happens once a year. It's and the date is set from your date, usually when you start in the company or something like that, you get your first evaluation. A non-programmed decision is not as structured, it's not set in stone. It's a decision about something that doesn't happen very often or maybe only occasionally once in a while. So you don't have a quick and easy response already set. And so an example in the business world of doing that would be, when do we launch a new feature on a product? Well, when we think conditions are right. And what will we be doing then? We'd be looking at the marketplace, we'd be looking at economics, we'd be looking at our sector, where do we stand in market share and so forth, and what exactly are the competitors doing. We would look at a lot of things like that, and then we would make a decision. Of course, we would lay out all the alternatives. Well, if we did it at this date, what would be favorable? And the next date, what would be favorable, and so forth. So something like that is unstructured, what we would call a non-programmed decision. Now, there are various conditions that affect our decision making, but it's all, again, about certainty. Now, certainty uh, is that condition that happens when we either have enough information or we don't have enough information. So if you think of the condition of certainty and how it affects making a decision, it's on a continuum of behavior. Here, under certainty means that you know when you're making a decision all the potential alternatives, and you know all the details of each one so that you're able to choose the best one from the list. But that's not necessarily reality. Most of the decisions in life, and in particular in business, are not made under certainty. You don't always know what all the alternatives are, and you don't always know what all the risks associated. So you come to the other category of, well, you make a decision under risk. Well, when you make it under risk, you are able to still generate the list of potential alternatives to choose from, and you are able to assign a amount of risk to making each choice, what it would entitle, and what would be the implications of doing each one. So this is much more common in the business world than under just under certainty, where you know all the facts about everything. You don't. When you make a decision under risk, you're evaluating what the potential risks are, and there might be some of the alternatives you don't know. Now, when you make a decision under uncertainty, then this is the hardest situation to be in. Over here, under certainty, you know all the facts about each alternative, and you are able to generate all the alternatives. You are information rich. That is not generally how things go. Under here, we are able to generate the list with a certain amount of assurance, and then we evaluate the risks for each alternative, some of which we may not be able to, with complete assurance, understand all the risks. Here, we do decision making under uncertainty. You do not know all the alternatives, and you do not also know all the risks associated with each. So therefore, you don't know the consequences of necessarily choosing one consequence over another, what might be the implications. So this is certainly the hardest thing, the hardest area where to make a successful decision, making it under uncertainty. Under risk is one thing, under uncertainty is really difficult. Well, these are the two areas where most decisions in business happen by far. And it is rare to come over to here where you make a decision where you know all the facts, all the alternatives, the risks about everything. There's simply too many unknowns in business. So we make decisions under certainty. You know what the alternatives are, all the conditions associated with each alternative. That's not necessarily reality. Decision making under risk, you can generate the list of alternatives to choose from to make a decision, and you generally know the potential payoffs and the costs associated with all the risks, generally. But when you get over here to uncertainty, you are in the uncertain territory for certain, because you do not know all the alternatives that you might choose from, and you don't necessarily know all the risks associated with each. So here is the worst place for making a good decision, the toughest area, and you can't always understand what the consequences of your actions might be. Now here, what we see is we're really dealing with the concepts of certainty, where we know it all, risk, where we can judge the different potential factors that affect each thing, and then uncertainty, where we're not sure of all the factors and we don't necessarily know all the risks associated with each one. As you can see, the chances of making a bad decision are higher when we go over here towards uncertainty, and almost can make a best decision every time if we had perfect certainty. And so the level of ambiguity also rises with the greater risk and the greater levels of uncertainty. So this is a continuum of environment that we might find ourselves in, of certainty, risk, and uncertainty, that you make as a decision maker. And so depending on the significance of the decision, how much might be on the line and how much might be important because of it, you would certainly want to at least be over here with risk, where you could analyze and have some idea of what the potential for things going wrong would be with any given choice. Now here we have the classical model of decision making as opposed to the normal everyday model of decision making. And this one here aligns very much with the idea we were just talking about, here where we know all of the facts with certainty. Well, that's kind of what the classical model of decision making is about. Managers, when they're faced with making a decision, they ought to be able to get perfect information, eliminate all uncertainty, and evaluate all the facets of the situation logically and rationally. And then, of course, when you can do these things right here, you will make the best decision and so forth. Well, that is true in the perfect world. And so that's why I say generally it's very rare we're going to find perfect certainty in the business world. Therefore, this classical model of decision making, which really is talking about perfect certainty here, eliminating all uncertainty, obtaining complete and perfect information, the ability to evaluate everything logically and rationally. It's simply not reality. So what we do is we just look at it in several different levels when we're trying to make a decision. The first thing we want to ask ourselves is the choice we're going to make from this list of alternatives, is it feasible? Well, if it doesn't seem feasible, I mean, at the basic level, can we do it? If not, well, then why are we spending our time talking about it? Is it a satisfactory one? If we ran it through the utilities of justice, fairness, rights, and caring, would it pass the test in most cases? If not, then probably maybe it's not an ethical decision that we're contemplating here. So it has to be satisfactory on many levels, and ethical would be one of them. Can we afford to do it? We might be able to do it. It might pass these tests here. It's feasible. We could do it. And we'd be happy if we did it. But could we afford it or not? Well, that becomes a decision that you really have to look at quite explicitly with the costs and all the costs, not just the financial costs. And then if it's yes on all of those things, of course, then probably we should choose that particular course of action. Now, as opposed to the classical model of decision making, we have this one. This is reality, the administrative model of decision making. So what happens in the real world when you have to make a decision, a manager usually has incomplete information. He has imperfect, or she has imperfect information. And they're constrained by bounded rationality and a tendency that all of us have in American culture to satisfice. And when these things happen, we end up making a decision that's not necessarily going to serve in our best interests or the best interests of the organization. So we really want to be careful about that. But we need to define here these concepts of bounded rationality and of satisficing. Now, bounded rationality is the idea that every person, but in this case we're talking about decision makers, are limited by their life perspective, by the way they view the universe, by the sort of bubble of reality that they travel around in day to day. So it's how they look at life, how they interpret information, how they respond to other people. It's their view of the universe, which is limited by their intellectual capacity, their past experiences, and all these sorts of things. So we all have a bounded rationality, and we tend to share a lot of things culturally, which are part of each our own bounded rationalities. And most of the time, we're operating with other people who tend to think generally like ourselves. Well, that's a cultural reflection that we share a lot of things in common. Sometimes when we run into people that are different from ourselves, what we're really seeing is two bounded rationalities that are very different because they come from different cultures colliding, and we get a little bit of culture clash. So bounded rationality, again, is that sense of it's the way we view the world in our particular universe and how we act within it. So we can never make a decision beyond the limits of our capabilities, in other words. Now, we also have a tendency in American culture to do this thing called satisficing. And satisficing is simply taking the quick, easy answer that solves the problem so we can move on to something else. Again, this is a reflection of our uh, obsession with impatience, our obsession with time, that time is valuable and that we can't waste it, so we must move on. But it really is, it's a little deeper than that. It's a psychological thing that's going on in our cognitive processes. And our brain does it as a way to avoid having to make a long, drawn out decision making process for everything that comes along. So in our culture, we have a tendency, because we are a little impatient and so forth, to take the quick, easy answer. Um, and that's fine. We get through our daily lives interacting with our peers. They're also in the same state of mind, a similar bounded rationality where, yeah, we're all in a little bit of hurry. We only have an hour for lunch or half an hour. So if we're going to agree on what we're going to do and we're going to do it together, let's make a quick decision. And we tend to do that with many things. We make a lot of quick decisions simply to save ourselves mental energy and so forth. Well, that's fine in everyday life, but it is not fine in the business world. When you make a serious decision, you cannot satisfice. You have to resist the tendency to satisfice. And that's why I said earlier that when we generate our list of alternatives, this is probably where in our culture we are fairly weak when it comes to decision making. We do not spend the time that it takes sometimes, or as often as we ought to really develop a list of alternatives, those choices that we could possibly choose from to make the most effective, indeed the best decision. And so we have to always combat this because it's something pretty much all of us do. And it's just a natural thing in human nature, particularly prevalent in American culture, satisficing. So we're not only constrained when we make decisions by this notion of satisficing and so forth and bounded rationality. We have other things that do touch on us and act on us and cause us to behave in certain ways. Um, when we talk about coalitions, we're really talking about a little bit of political activity. This exists in the workplace like it does in life. You are never going to be separate the things that happen in real life and in culture with what goes on in the workplace. They're just reflections of each other. And so people will tend to form coalitions and groups when, and in particular, when there's a decision to be made, and if it's a group decision, then you do see these informal alliances, which are really coalitions, and building coalitions is a form of political activity. And it's done to achieve a goal. Sometimes they're incredibly serious, other times they're not so serious, but it is a behavioral aspect of the decision-making process. And we are very much influenced by coalition building and political activity. We also use our intuition, and our intuition comes from within. It's innate belief that comes from your subconscious often. It's built on past experiences and your education and your level of thought and so forth. But it's really, you could sum it up also as a gut feeling. And those affect your decision making. Sometimes there's a preponderance of evidence when you're looking at all the alternatives that you can choose from to make a decision, and it's tough to choose amongst several alternatives that are all very equally uh, with good implications that might equally do the job. And so, how do you really choose? Well, you don't flip a coin. You're going to use your subconscious power of intuition. It's a sense that you have that something feels like this might be the right way to go. And we also have a constraint, the escalation of commitment, of course, where we just can't stop doing it. We've invested so much time in the project or so much time in this or that practice that we just can't seem to stop. And in fact, if anything, to prove that we need to keep doing it because we like doing it so much or for whatever the personal reason might be, we enhance it and we sort of nurture it. And sometimes this is a real thing. We have to know when to say, it's time to make a change. And that's really what the controlling process and management is all about in making decisions, is you analyze information as you go, you evaluate, and you make assessments. And so whether it's a process or a project or relations between team members or whatever it is, you have to look at that and be able to say, it's time to make a change here. And here's what I think might be a way to go. And so you want to avoid the escalation of commitment. And really the key to it is being able to see it. And sometimes if you're part of that escalation of commitment, it is difficult to see it. And then, of course, we have risk propensity, which does influence certainly, because I've talked quite a bit about risk here, particularly in the light of the alternatives and what the implication of each is. But when we talk about risk propensity, it's about the individual. How much risk are you willing to take? What is a reasonable risk from your point of view? What are you willing to gamble? How much when you're making the decision to get where you want to go? And so here is a nice little summary of what I've talked about here. And you can refer back to this when you need to later on. All sorts of other things come into play when we're making decisions, particularly, well, an ethical sort of perspective. We as employees bring our ethics to our managerial style. The organization that we work for has a set of espoused values, a sense also of culture, and those things define what the company stands for and what it is. Those affect our ethics, particularly if the organization actually does what it says it stands for and it enacts those espoused values, then of course that's a builder of very strong managerial ethics. So you bring your own ethics, you interact with other people, and then you also bring your stances, ethical stances in your relationships externally with other economic agents like those in your supply chain, your producers and suppliers of parts, and your distributors and the transportation companies you work with, and all those sorts of players. Now let's just switch gears a little bit here and talk a very small amount about group decision making. Now, we have a couple different forms of decision making. This is decision making in groups at a very basic level. So let's just talk about it from that perspective. An interacting group or team is just consists of a newly formed group that has been created for some specific reason. They need to make a decision on some matter. And then when they're done, the group will disband and so forth. It should be composed of diverse members whenever possible from across the firm and so forth. You would make the types of decisions who to include and so forth. But it's mainly what we would call sort of an ad hoc group or something like that. Delphi groups are a little bit different. These are groups of experts. Now, there used to be a time before the internet when Delphi groups met by telephone. They also exchanged letters. They sent surveys and questionnaires around to each other, and there would be a panel of them in the Delphi group who had been hired by some company. And it was a lengthy process of mailing back and forth and so forth, and in the end, producing a report. Well, Delphi groups still exist today. Their work is so much easier due to Zoom and other technological advances. But they do never meet in person, really. These are far-flung experts who could be anywhere, indeed not even necessarily in the same country. And so they meet virtually. They do exchange ideas and information about the topic at hand, and they produce a report to whoever has hired them and so forth. And they use the internet and software to do it. And quite often, they're like a think tank. They would complete surveys, give analysis, and so forth. Now, a nominal group is very similar to an interacting group or team. It's a group that's been created to do a specific task and so forth, and it's generally done for something that's significant in the sense that it's a really important project, and it's done to take care of it and address this one issue, at least until they can resolve it in some way. They're not always as formal as other groups. It might just be that opinions are sought and so forth. So it's sort of like something you would just choose, okay, get some of our top managers on this idea. And so you would contact a few and say, we're an informal group. We would like your opinion and your analysis on this idea and so forth. And you would sort of work from that premise. So you may not have as many formal type meetings, but the seriousness of the task at hand and so forth would still be just as high, maybe just a little bit formal, less formal, than an interacting group or team with specific starting and ending points and all of the rest. And here you see my summary of what this is all about, the nominal groups, individual contributions, what is your opinion, tell me what your analysis is, and then at some point we'll take all those different analyses and look at them and reach some decisions, maybe in compilation with other members, maybe not. This is different than forming a new group, solving a specific problem, disbanding as soon as you've done it, and so forth, and then the Delphi group, which is the panel of experts. Now, when we make group decisions and so forth, there are ups and downs, the advantages and disadvantages. Certainly, groups make more information and knowledge available. So it is a big advantage when you have people in a group, particularly people who are different from each other, or at least at a minimum come from different departments and have different perspectives, different jobs. So what is likely to happen in that atmosphere? You're likely to get many more alternatives in your list of choices. And that's what you want, right? You want to get the biggest and most robust list of alternatives to choose from. You also find that with groups that the final decision is more likely to be accepted by everyone because you have worked it out. Everyone gets a chance to speak and so forth is one of the advantages. Everyone is part of the group. It should not, it's rare when everyone is not participating in a group. And so when that happens, you may not agree with every decision in a group, but you will support the group members and the group itself and the final decisions that you make. What happens in this atmosphere is that your communication skills are enhanced, they do improve, and you do get better decisions in the end because of that enhanced communication. Generally, the best decisions come out of groups versus individual decision making. Now, the downside is, okay, it takes longer to have meetings to discuss the results. So in that sense, it costs you more money. Sometimes, depending on the makeup of the group, if you don't pay really good attention to the makeup, then you might get compromised decisions, you might get indecisiveness, you might get some political activity, some coalition building or so forth. What also might happen is you might have one strong personality that tends to dominate the group. If this happens and nobody else speaks up, you generally don't accomplish much. Also, you have to be careful that that one person dominating isn't somebody's supervisor in there in particular. If it's one of those situations, you might want to reconsider having that supervisor on the committee. It will really detain in a very big way. It's a big disadvantage. And people just will not be frank. They will not say things that they would normally want to contribute for fear of whatever the reaction of their boss might be. And then another large problem is groupthink. If you are not diverse enough, if you are too homogenous in the group, too alike in whatever way it is, you may have the tendency for groupthink. And groupthink is hard to pin when you're part of it. You may not see it. But everybody agreeing, easy agreements, always everything going so smooth. Sometimes that doesn't always sound right, but it can happen. And so you do have to be careful of that as well. It is a big downside of working in groups. So you want to make your group and team decisions being more effective. Now, these are things that you would want to do that would really help alleviate most of those downsides, the disadvantages. Simply be aware. Read the dynamics of what's going on in the group. Always set a deadline. If you're in a newly created group and so forth, you really want to have a deadline for when it's over, the clear ending of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Really work on the problem of dominance. Everybody participates. And so even when you, in certain circumstances, you may have to go round robin, and as whoever the chair is may have to ask each person, what do you think? You haven't said anything yet. We'd like to hear what your thoughts are. And then before you speak up and try and solve the world's problems in that committee, perhaps it's a good strategy for yourself, just as an individual, to listen to all the discourse before you just jump in with both feet, and make sure you're hearing everything and what the currents are. And again, read the dynamics of the situation. Now, it's always good, particularly when there's something controversial or something that's maybe contested, to have the devil's advocate. This is just a mechanism you use. One person says, I'll be the devil's advocate. This means all these tough questions I'm now going to ask aren't coming from me. They're coming from anybody who would ask a serious, tough question about this situation. And so don't hold me accountable, but this is what we could run into. And so that person will ask the very unsavory questions that nobody wants to ask and not be held accountable personally for it. So devil's advocate is quite effective, and so forth. And so, but it has to be handled right. There has to be a clear understanding that, hey, this needs to be talked about. Obviously, look how contentious everybody's getting. And then, of course, once you've done what you think, and you've adjourned and ended the group, you always check back to see, did you, reach your purpose? Did you accomplish all the things that you wanted to do? So you may need a meeting, or you may just do it by email or something, but you always do follow up, and just to find out if we left anything out and so forth, and how does everybody feel about that. Okay, folks, that's all I have for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.